Hi everybody! I'm really excited to share with y'all probably my biggest project I've ever done. This is me making a 18th century tailcoat. I had never made formal wear before, and I had never done anything with collars, lapels, buttonholes, or sleeves. So yeah. Oh, another thing I did for the first time on this project is I made the pattern myself. Several of the pieces were modified from other patterns or from just looking at how other clothes around the house I was making this in were put together. I got the fabric at Joann's in this sportswear section. Not the sportswear, but the sport. It's a sport coat fabric. Figuring out the fabric to use for this tailcoat was quite an adventure. At first, I wasn't sure what to use. I was debating between a wool coat or using a heavy-duty linen, and I decided that the sports coat, which was a cotton poly blend, was my best bet because I didn't want to, I knew I was going to need to iron it, but I didn't want it to hold creases the same way that a 100% cotton weave fabric would have. And also, since it was a cotton poly blend, the basic care would be a lot easier, and it is a traditional sports jacket fabric, so I just really wanted it to look as authentic as I knew how to make it, even though I'd never made a jacket before, let alone a tailcoat. So yeah, finding the fabric was interesting. The way I chose between this and the other black poly cotton blends is I was actually looking for something with a specific texture, and I wanted it to have look like a bit of an old-fashioned weave that was a bit more traditional with strong up and down fibers. So the way I figured that out is I took the flashlight mode on my phone and I would actually shine it through the fabric, and then I narrowed it down from 6 choices to 2, and then to choose between the 2 because I wanted this to be able to be used for a event where it was important to look like the item belonged to a certain era and be somewhat historically accurate. I took photographs of it with my phone, and I did it with and without flash, and I chose the fabric based on which one looked a little more old-timey versus having a super shiny refractive reaction to camera flashes. And then how I decided to make the pattern is I mostly looked at how other things were constructed. I went upstairs and borrowed a coat jacket that was already made, like an old one from the 70s that wasn't needed anymore, and I just parked it in the closet you see behind me with the mirror doors, and I used that for figuring out how the parts needed to fit together. And I used photos of a character that had the style of coat that I was aiming for, and I just kind of worked shaping the pieces together like a tanagram puzzle. First on paper, I used a butcher block paper, which I can buy in a giant roll amount from my local art supply store, and I used that for the patterning pieces, and I figured out the shapes and before I cut into the fabric. So I kind of did a mock-up in paper. Filming this thing was a really big challenge. I was really surprised how difficult it was going to be just to film it. The project itself was already difficult because I was doing several things I'd never done before, but I really wanted it to be able to be produced into a time-lapse video, so I also wanted to film it, and I think I've just about physically worn out my poor camera. I don't know how many more projects or even just basic photos I'm really going to be able to get from it without doing something. I mean, I can try replacing my battery, but I don't know if that'll completely solve the problem I'm having. This project was so technically intense, and it took me so long to wrap my head around the different parts that, camera, 3-year warranty. It took me about 1.5 years of filming, and this project was in the planning for the first year I had it while I did the smaller time-lapse videos you see and attended the events that you see videos of on my YouTube channel, My Mark Studios. And it was just a blast. The year was really intense, and I learned, this project took so long that you can pretty much see my filming technique as I learn things, like the quality sharply goes up throughout the time-lapse video. And my main goal was to kind of make something that focused on the thing I was making and not necessarily myself. So you won't really see, well, you'll see me, but you won't really see it focusing on me. My main goal was to have the middle of the shots on the tailcoat, because I didn't see any videos on YouTube of anybody else making a tailcoat, and the only videos I could find where of any kind of formal coat were really lengthy, kind of boring in their approach, and I ended up having to piece 6 or 7 videos together. I had to ask friends for help, and yeah, no, there is no way I could have done this project alone. You see me actually physically assembling it on the screen, but the reality is I have spent like 2/3 of this process. It's impossible to get on film because it's me sitting there and looking up information and looking at the end result and talking to people with a lot more experience than I, and figuring out how to approach things. Plus it'd be really boring if I could even film it, because it's just a lot of me sitting there and literally staring at the project while I'm processing, well, how the heck do I get this to fold this way versus that way, so that when it's on me or on a person, it goes down the body correctly. So that's another thing about this project, is I focused on how it would look on a body versus on a hanger. If you want to go to any kind of fashion school or design school, they focus as much on how something appears on the hanger and that looking nice as they do is with how it should appear when somebody's wearing it. And my main goal was this looking really good while somebody was wearing it, and not in how it would look hanging up. So when I have it hanging up on a hanger, it doesn't look that fantastic. But yeah, that's because I was really focusing on how it would look on somebody versus not. So as you can see at the beginning of the video, I initially made it not sure if I was going to attach the tails of the tailcoat with the back piece and have them be all one big piece, or if I was going to attach the tails later, but I changed my mind partway through. I decided it would be best for making sure that the tailcoat's laid right and that the jacket wouldn't hike up on me and give the illusion of a flatter, more masculine frame where the different parts hit correctly on me if I added the tail part of the tailcoat afterwards. And what you're seeing me do with I'm physically using chalk like you use on a chalkboard to mark out my seams. I am very budget conscious. This fabric that I bought for this is the most expensive fabric I have ever bought for one singular project. And I really wanted to do the best I could to learn as much as I could with it, because I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to afford that much fabric again all at once. So I decided to just kind of go for it. That's part of why I was like, you know what? Even though it's more advisable to learn all these different skills on different projects and then have them compiled together into one, I'm just gonna go ahead and do it all at once. And that was my reasoning is, hey, I have a really low budget. I can barely afford the fabric. So that the way I kept the part of the way I kept the project down is I didn't get seam, what's it called, the markers or the little pencils that are actually designed to be on fabric and then wash out. I just straight up used colored chalk. It ended up working to my advantage. You can see several times where I fold, I'll mark up one side of the tailcoat and then I'll fold it in half and I'll kind of pat it down so that the other side ends up with marks on it. So that ended up just a bit of caution, unlike with something that's actually designed for being used for sewing and fashion and stuff. The chalk can physically stain the fabric, so you want to make sure that the fabric is pretty dry when you do it, and you want to try to you want a highly contrasting color. I recommend pink. If you don't have pink, a light brown works, but occasionally go over it with a slightly damp cloth and wipe off your chalk marks. And preferably do that before you stick them in a washer or you seal that section of a seam. Don't wash it and then dry it without double checking that all that chalk's off. Otherwise, it can permanently stain a section of your project. So, yeah, but other than that, I love chalk for sewing and marking because of the ability to fold over and get it to transfer to the other half of a garment that I want to be identical on both sides. As I progress through this, you can see that I kind of did the stitching and design in 3 or 4 steps. I would start out with figuring out what shape the piece of fabric needed to be with paper, and then I'd kind of assemble a mock-up of it with paper, and then I'd kind of mark out, if it was somewhat of a simpler area, I'd mark out what it needed to be shaped like and look like with pens, as in like little hat point pens. But if I needed a bit of a guide of where the pins went, you'll see me mark down where they needed to go and where the stitching physically needed to go in chalk first. And then I'd baste the pieces together, which is essentially just using the running stitch. And then I'd take the pins out and I'd try it on very carefully. Actually, I lied. I didn't always take the pins out. If you have to try something on with pins in the item still, be very careful, because yeah, it's a bit like trying on a cactus. You don't want to poke yourself. But I would take out the pins that I could and baste them in place. And then I'd go over it with the sewing machine. Another thing I did with this tailcoat is I was very, very conscientious of the seams and the seam allowance. I've since learned it's probably better to deal with 1/2 to 1/4 inch seams to keep your item from being too bulky in certain spots. But it's not necessarily I was overcautious and I went 1 to 2 inches per seam each side. So I would, in total, you'd have 4 extra inches. That's 2 inches just all the way around each section. And as I was going along, I did the best I could, making sure all the edges of any loose bit of fabric weren't just unfinished. I did my best to do a type of seam finishing called French press seams, and that's why you see me right here rolling up the edges and then pinning them down very carefully, because I wanted the seams to be as finished and final looking as I could get them. This helps with overall wear, and it helps with the overall strength of the garment, and it helps prevent loose threads from being everywhere, and it just makes the lines nicer and crisper. And especially the front part of this tailcoat. So I am a big round person, and I wanted to create the illusion of a more masculine chest when I was wearing the tailcoat, and I wanted to also have it kind of like stick out and lay nice. And because the picture I was basing this off of, the character the majority of the tailcoat was based off of, always looks like squeaky clean and perfect. And he's a butler, so a butler in the late Victorian, early Edwardian days. And I wanted to create that illusion of just everything just laying perfectly, as perfect as it could on me, to kind of help convey that action. Because one of the things I was going to use this tailcoat for initially in the planning stages was cosplaying him, but it honestly has ended up being used more for everything else. Apparently I really, really, really needed a tailcoat for a lot of my steampunk stuff, so that's what ended up happening. But having the French press seams on the bottom of the front helps it just lay a little better on me, despite the fact that I'm a big round person. It helps create the illusion that I'm a bit slimmer than I actually am. So that required just like a lot of tinkering with the design, and just staring at it and being like, well, if I add slightly extra fabric here and reduce the fabric here and move the seam for the shoulder slightly over here so it's still on my shoulder, but it will encourage it to do this. Yeah, it really helped with that at the bottom. I was surprised how much it helped with that. But yeah, no, I'm really proud of that part of this project. that little metal thing you see me using when I'm putting pins in right here is called a hem gauge, and I used it to make sure that my French press seams were all on all sides proportionately about the same width in, and so I didn't overdo it. And that in combination with looking at how it needed to pin down, especially with the tailcoat going around that curve, it was interesting. I could have added little tiny notches in the fabric, but I didn't want to, so instead I just kind of, you can see me doing on the other side too, I'll go down the straight part and to a certain point, and then I'll start at the tip again and work my way up, and then I'll kind of like gently fold small pleats to get that finished seam just really nice looking. And something I noticed with a lot of store-bought tailcoats is the tails kind of tend to curve, but they curve like out so you see the seam. And I went ahead and took my time to very carefully do that along the edges of the tails to make sure it curved in slightly versus out. Again, adding to kind of the perfection illusion. And yeah, it also helped add just a little bit of stiffness to the tails, just like it did the front, just along the edges, kind of helping them when I'm moving about and wearing the tailcoat, helping it just kind of flow better. So what you see me doing a lot is I'm sewing with pins in. You're not really technically supposed to do that. You're supposed to baste everything down and then sew every time. But when I'm finishing seam edges like that, and they're very difficult to get to lay flat, I actually find the pins hold it together better, and then the finished seam ends up being better. You just have to be really careful while you're sewing, because if your needle hits a pin on the way down, your machine needle, it will break the machine needle and or possibly your pin and or possibly rip the fabric. So just go really slow and make sure that the next stitch is going to go either over the needle or remove the needle, the pin before the sewing needle reaches that point. So yeah, just a heads up on that part. Oh, another thing you'll notice as it progresses is the finished project has a collar and lapels. You're supposed to add the front part of the lapels to the front breast part of your jacket design. I had never added lapels to something, so I ended up creating kind of a pocket solution, because this is the most expensive fabric I've ever used in my life. And also at that point, I had done I put all this effort into like finishing edges and stuff, and I was like, no, I'm not going to do that all again. So I ended up I had to create both the front and the back of the lapel, and then like turn the lapel inside out, and like it was a pillow, and then tuck the raw edges in to the front part of the breast of my tailcoat but that ended up adding yet another layer of stiffness that just helps create the illusion that I'm actually slimmer than I am. Also, if freshly ironed, creates the illusion that I am far more of a neat person than I am. I try so hard to be neat, but in all honesty, you walk in to any place, especially when I'm in the middle of a project, and it kind of looks like an F5 tornado hit the area. So yeah, no, not a neat person. I guess you could use interfacing along the edges to do that, but just the French press seams with the suit fabric, the sports coat suit fabric, did that for me, especially with like the way the weave worked in this particular fabric and how well it filmed as well as how well it photographed. I'm so glad I took all that time figuring out all those little individual steps with this project. I had a couple points on this project, and you're looking at one now where the project almost got abandoned and didn't get finished because I was just like, what the frick did I get myself into? No, I must be mad. Why the hell am I trying to learn all these new things all at once? I should have done smaller, simpler projects to introduce one new idea at a time. And you can see me getting out my phone and looking at the same tutorials again and again and again and again, trying to figure out what the heck I'm doing. And the collar and lapels were one point, and another point later on in the project is these sleeves. So there were like 2 to 3 month periods of me just being like, if you're following my Facebook or if you know me personally, you'll be like, well, how are you doing today? And all that's going through my head and all that I could think to respond in Messenger would be sleeves or lapels or the collar. Yeah. Definitely wouldn't have gotten this done without some friends' help. Thank you so much, friends. Not just for moral support, but like I had some people step up with tailoring experience, and they would like spend hours verbally walking me through different parts of the step I was on. And I am not the best listener. Sometimes I'm okay. I'd say when I'm at that level of overwhelmed, I'm a bit of an idiot. Thank you for tolerating me. I love you guys. But yeah, no, my advice when taking advice is take the advice and say thank you, and don't be like, I'm gonna do it better. If you've never done it before, just try the way, because you might not understand why there's a reason for a step for something. And when you've had a bit more experience with something, yeah, just listen to them and not necessarily the nicest person when I'm overwhelmed. Thank you for having the patience for dealing with me. I really appreciate you guys. So you're technically supposed to attach the front and back of a collar and lapels together and then attach the back of the collar, but because the lapels ended up being made the funny part with both the front and back, the one place on this tailcoat that everything doesn't look perfect is the corner where the lapels and collar meet. On the tailcoat, I kind of really cleverly hid it as best as I could, and I did as best as I could with hand sewing, but there's a little bit of pucker on each side of the back bottom part of the collar because I had to undo the part of the collar to do the funny thing to get the front and back of the lapels attached, because I didn't create the back of the lapels on the front part of the jacket in the first place like you're supposed to. So part of the way I got the collar to lay so flat is what you see me pinning down now, and that's I'm not sure what that part's called, but I went above and beyond, because in a lot of shirts that part is just really, really loose and it kind of hangs there. But again, I wanted to make sure on my jacket as much of any part of raw edging was finished as possible. So I took the time to make the part bigger. I went ahead and folded the underparts in. I actually used hidden stitch to stitch that part down, and it ended up making the collar and lapels stability really, really strong, despite the fact that I didn't quite assemble the tailcoat like you're supposed to up front. still debating to this day. Right now it's an unlined tailcoat. There is no lining in it, and my original goal was to line it, but I'm just kind of happy I ended up with a tailcoat instead of like an abandoned project still. But sometimes I sit there and I go, well, do I really want to line it? Because people, when I take it off and I show them, they're just amazed at all the detail work in the seam finishing and how I made sure one part of one kind of seam was finished and pressed before the next stage and next part of the seam. And all that would be hidden by a liner. So kind of on the fence, I went ahead and got the lining fabric thinking that this tailcoat was going to be a lined one, but I don't know. Heads up, if you're making this and you need it to be cosplay quality and not necessarily professional quality, you do not have to finish the seams on a garment. But I'm just persnickety and I'm klutzy and I wanted the extra strength that the seam finishing provided. And it also ended up helping the garment hang better. So that's why I went ahead and finished the seams, even though I was thinking that I was gonna go ahead and line it. But yeah, if I went into like a journeyman contest, it might be better to just go ahead and leave this project unlined so somebody can see all the effort I put into finishing all the seams on the tailcoat and everything. Plus, it's just easier access to something if it rips in the future, or as you wear a garment, parts wear out and you got to go in and do repairs. And if there's a lining, you end up having to open up the edge of the lining to get to the part that's having the issues and replace it and or repair it or patch it. And without that lining, I don't have to do that extra step. Also, it works better in climates where it's a lot hotter without a lining, but a bit, to be honest, I'm in Colorado and we have 4 seasons here, and I am cold during fall. I am cold during like 8 months out of the year if I try to use this tailcoat as even as a slightly warm jacket. So the advantage of choosing to line it in the future would be that I wouldn't be so cold, and it would probably hang slightly better yet again, because lining fabric is kind of silky, and when it brushes up against what you're currently wearing, it slides around better. So that's the advantage of a lining. So tailcoat is a coat. It's meant to be worn over a dress shirt and vest, and that lining helps it just smoothly slide over you as you move and continue to lay right, versus possibly getting slightly hung up and not you need to tug it to get it back into place and hanging the way it's supposed to. Not doing that. So remember how I said you're supposed to attach the back of the collar first? What you see me doing right now is kind of the rough fitting repair that you're not necessarily supposed to have to do, but I ended up having to do. A combination of the whip and hidden stitch. Because if you make your collar right, you actually sew those pieces together from the other side with the machine. Speaking of machines, the machine you're seeing in here, I work with a very old machine. I've tried to buy a modern machine in the past that does multiple different kinds of stitches, but alas, I find that I can never quite get one that works. I always end up with one that I just bought, but it immediately needs major repairs in order to just do basic stitches. And so I kind of, the machine you see me using used to belong to my grandmother, and it does one thing and one thing very well. It does the straight stitch. I'm incredibly fond of it, but anything that wasn't a straight stitch or needed a different kind of stitch in this project ended up being hand done because I just don't have access to a machine that can do it. It only does one thing and one thing very well. I'm a little bit confused when other people go looking for a machine and they're like, look, this one does 150 bajillion different kinds of stitches. And I'm like, don't you? If you need that many kinds of stitches, are you doing embroidery? Wouldn't it be better to get a free arm embroidery specialty machine then? Because in all honesty, I only ever seen 2 kinds of stitches used, and honestly, the other kind of stitch I've seen used is the zigzag stitch, and as long as you're a little careful, you can do the same kind of job with a couple parallel straight stitches instead of the zigzag. So yeah, I love I love this old machine. It turns on and it goes forward, and it did end up jammed a couple times, but I was able to tinker with the upper and bottom tension and get the problem solved myself versus having to take it to a repair place. And also a really big advantage of this old machine is that there's a dial on the top, so you can change how much puncture strength is put behind the needle. So if I really wanted to, I could probably do a few layers of denim with this machine. Yeah, that power really helped when I was finishing seams, and then I was going over sections where 2 parts that had finished seams had to fit together smoothly. Other machines would have just, newer machines would have just given up the ghost and been like, no, and I would have had to do some work by hand and it wouldn't have quite laid as nice as getting it laid down by machine. So even though I have to do a large part of anything that can't be done with a straight stitch by hand, it actually ended up, because of the trade-off is having the ability to adjust that puncture power. And yeah, that made a really big difference. Another thing is, I'm really fortunate. My grandmother likes keeping supplies on hand just in case. So I only ended up having to buy 1 spool full of thread for this entire project. I ended up using up 3 spools of thread, and my guess is it would have been 8 spools of thread, except for I found a vintage spool made of wood. Well, just to put it bluntly, they do not put as much thread on spools. The spools are a lot shallower nowadays. There's literally not as much thread per spool as there used to be. And the wooden spools are from back in the day where you'd take your spool in once it was empty to the store, and they'd use a spool filler to fill it up with the color of thread you wanted to get again, and then you'd pay for the thread. And it was full, and it was sitting there, and I was like, okay, I'll just use this up now. So yeah, I went through one slightly less old spool, and then I went ahead and I'm gonna post a picture of it on my Instagram or my Mark Studio when I finally do, because it's black thread. When I finally do use up that spool of thread, I'm going to put a picture up of it next to one of the modern day spools empty, and you'll just be able to see the difference. But yeah, there was so much thread on because it was loaded before my grandma stopped sewing as much. It was fully loaded with thread and just sitting there, and I went, thank you, I'll just use this up now, and I'll make sure it gets used on something useful. Really fortunate in that area. You're supposed to be picky with the kind of thread you use. So with a cotton and poly blend, it's recommended that you actually use cotton thread. Honestly, the spool is full of poly blend thread. Just like the fabric was made of, and I didn't see any major performance difference in being particularly picky with the kind of thread I used. Oh, here you see my camera suddenly just gets a lot narrower with 2 black bars on the side. This was me attempting to keep myself motivated to finish it because I was just kind of in a burnout mode, and also at the time I was getting frustrated at how much progress I was able to make every day, because as I said, I initially set out for this to be a time-lapse video, and I didn't expect for the entire project to take as long as it did. And one of the things that was making it take so long is I could only do so much filming a day, and then my camera had to stop and charge before I could do more filming, because I would literally work it until it died, and then I'd have to stop everything I was doing and wait 3 to 4 hours for my camera to charge again. And after working 5 hours continuously with maybe a 10-minute break for the internal mechanisms of the camera to cool down, 5 hours for charging, that meant that I was pretty much done for the day unless I decided to sleep while my camera was charging and then get up again. So my sleeping patterns for a while were completely dictated via, oh, is my camera charged? Okay, I'm filming. Is my camera not charged? I'm sleeping so that I can be awake the next time my camera is charged. So I definitely don't want to do this again without multiple batteries or maybe even multiple cameras. I tried out my phone on a couple different clips here, and I tried doing a couple lives and then just downloading the footage from those lives and editing them into the overall. So that's what the narrower shots are, is you can actually still see them. I still have them up on my Facebook, My Mark Studios Facebook page. And if you like my page, you can see my videos. You can see the original content of these lives, not sped up. But yeah, I decided it wasn't worth it. I didn't like the narrower shots. I didn't feel like you guys could see as much and follow along with what I was doing. And having you guys sort of be able to follow along with what I was doing was half the point of the time lapse, because I often find that if I'm stuck on a project, I'm able to figure out how to get unstuck by watching somebody else work with the material, and I don't necessarily learn that much from listening to somebody talk about it. I get the information I need by watching them physically mess with the material. So that's part of why I chose to do time lapse, because then I can help other people that are stuck. Also, time lapses are really relaxing and enjoyable to watch, and it's just kind of fun to see a culmination of longer projects all work together, and yeah, it's kind of soothing. Seeing somebody mess with material is, especially with a little bit of music in the background, it's kind of like watching a ballet. So that's nice. It can help with when I get artist block or something. I'll watch other people's art time lapses, and it's just really nice way to unwind and spend time. So it's what motivates me to make them too. So you're seeing me trying to figure out how to sew on the front of the lapels and the back of the lapels now, and not have any raw edges showing. And yeah, this part was a really big challenge because I should have had fabric that was already there to support and tuck in that top part too, and I didn't. As I said before, I had to make both parts and then attach both parts to the final jacket. So if you look really closely on the final jacket at the lapels, it actually didn't end up being quite straight, and I was having width problems where the part where the lapel attached to the collar was too wide. But yeah, just a lot of tinkering later and several times of me crying later, I finally got them attached somehow. I'm not quite sure how. This was so hard on me with everything I was trying to juggle at once. I'm not sure I'll ever quite have the motivation to make something with lapels and collar again. It just took so much out of me to get it to just lay right, and I don't know. As of right now, I don't have the equipment. I don't have the funds. I don't have the motivation. I kind of spent it on this one project, and knowing that this might be the one I can do without some sort of substantial circumstantial help, like donations or something, to make buying the materials easier. So yeah. Something I notice a lot of people have trouble with when they're machine sewing and they're just beginning is they have a very hard time figuring out how they should start a row of something. And I start a couple inches in a straight line, and I like prepping more than I like taking the time to fix it later, even though I still end up spending almost twice as much the amount of time fixing something usually than I do actually being able to use it. But yeah, a lot of quality time with the seam ripper, even though I try to prep everything ahead of time. But I will physically mark out where my row is, and I'll start a couple inches in. I'll go forward a couple stitches, literally a couple stitches, and then I'll throw my machine into reverse and go all the way to the edge, and then I'll push it forward again. Push the lever so it'll go forward again, and going over that same section of straight stitch twice actually helps lock the straight stitch in. What you're seeing me mess with now is after the collar and lapels were finally attached, these sleeves, I had never made anything with sleeves before, and I had no clue how a sleeve was supposed to be shaped. I had no clue how to fit a sleeve in, and it was just a nightmare. One of the things I had the biggest hard time with is because I made the pattern myself, I wasn't sure how wide to make the top bell curve of the sleeve. So that resulted in a lot of back and forth. Also, something that ended up causing a really big problem, which is why I recommend now no more than a 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch seam allowance, is particularly when you're dealing with sleeves and the armpit section, where the side seam of a jacket comes into play with the same part that the around seam does for a sleeve of a jacket, is that area can get really, really, really bulky really, really, really quick. The bulkier it is, the more likely you are to just not be able to fit the pieces together, and the thickness of the fabric to literally prevent you from being able to finish that section. So, yeah. Sleeves. There's quite a period of time there where I was just sitting there and people would ask, "How are you doing?" And all I would be able to respond is sleeves, because my life was this project for such a long period of time. I needed a significant amount of help attaching the sleeves, and a friend that had experience as a professional tailor actually ended up helping me. And one of the problems I was having is I wanted this to look like a formal garment, but I wanted to be able to move around in it because it is a costume piece. And I needed to be able to do a lot of action poses in it. When it comes to sleeves, you either have it look straight edged and formal, but they tend to restrict your movement. Have you ever put on a jacket and just noticed that you can't lift up your arms all the way because it feels like the fabric is binding around your arm if it fits you correctly, so you end up going up slightly a size, but then everything else is baggy? Yeah, that's the problem with an arm that's fitted more formally and looks nice when you keep your shoulder down. But I needed the ability to move my arms around for action poses, but still have it look pretty formal. So I ended up doing all the gathering for the sleeve at the top, which created almost a slight mutton puff sleeve thing. And everybody says it looks really, really, really steampunk, which is ironically ended up working great because I end up wearing this coat for steampunk events a lot more frequently than I do for home stuff. And yeah, that little detail actually ended up adding to that aesthetic by accident. But most of the time when you do most of the gathering for a sleeve, you want to match the bottom of the sleeve seam with the side seam, creating the armpit area, and you want the gathering to be even all the way around. If you want the slight puff sleeve, make the actual physical cutout for the sleeves bigger, and it's not going to look as formal if you look at it very carefully, because it's not going to have that cool crisp kind of line. It's going to look a bit baggier. But yeah, then you can do action poses in your jacket versus being like, I can't move my arms without potentially ripping this fabric. So you can't have both. And it was actually I threw several fits trying to figure out a way to do both, and it's not possible to do both. So yeah, you got to choose one or the other, and it is a bit of a balance. That was a major thing I learned on the first sleeves I ever attached. Another thing that's really important when you're doing sleeves is to stop and finish. If you're going to finish the seams in the sleeves, in that line that goes under the bottom part of the sleeve, you've got to do that seam finishing before you attach the sleeves with the French press style seam finishing. So that has to be done. So that will effectively create 8-layer thick of fabric while you're attaching the sleeve. So that's part of why I suggest the bulk reduction approach of making that less than I did. And also, incidentally, ends up saving you money in the future. Part of the reason I was so cautious with such large seam allowances is I just wanted to allow myself a lot of extra time to just tinker with the taper of each section and make it wider if I needed it to, or more narrow if I needed it to, because I just never had sewn a fitted garment with a fabric that wasn't as stretchy. Before, I was used to working with something that wasn't really meant to be worn, that wasn't really stretchy at all, like linen fabric like sheets are made out of, or like a jersey that had really good four-way stretch. So yeah, first project where it was there was a little bit of stress along the biases, but it wasn't like an elastic like fabric where you could like really stretch it out. If you wanted something to do something, it was best to support it with making sure it was cut out along the biases correctly, and making sure it was pressed, and making sure that the structure of the garment just has it initially lay that way versus going, oh, it'll just stretch that way. It doesn't really work that way with sports suit fabric. So yeah. Getting closer to the tail end of this project, as I got closer and closer to the end, I found myself going over little sections and making sure the details were right where I wanted them to be. The attachment of sleeves themselves took quite some time, and then after I got those done, I essentially took my time going over every little section and making sure that it was laying down the way I wanted it to. At this point, when I started getting the sleeves on, I started thinking about buttons, and I wasn't sure what kind of buttons I wanted to do. I knew I wanted them to look as close to the buttons of the character that I was basing this tailcoat off of as possible, but that butler has family crest buttons, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to find something that looks similar. I ended up, after quite some time, finding some buttons, and they cost a pretty penny. I actually ended up passing on the first set of buttons I found that I thought would work. I'm really glad I held off on getting them, because the second pair I found ended up working out a lot better. This last little bit of filming, I had a tiny bit of help. The rest of this filming I had done all by myself, but I got a little bit of help from a friend that was actually from out of state, and it meant the world to me, because I was at the point again where I was like, this is taking too long. Is it even still worth it? I'm not sure. So yeah, they ended up pushing me through the last little bit of attaching the sleeves, and unfortunately I didn't get much time to hang out with them. I ended up spending their entire trip. I meant to show them a few things around town, but I didn't get to show them as many things as I wanted to. I ended up just mostly working on this tailcoat. It just ate everything. It ate all the time for everything, and yeah, I was seriously wondering if it was worth it to do everything by scratch like I had done towards the end. But in all honesty, because I did everything myself, it fits, or it fitted a lot better. The downside of being a big person is we tend to change our shape a lot, and my shape's changed quite a bit. I actually need to refine this jacket and try it on because it's been quite some time, and see if I need to take it in some places and let it out in others, and never ever finished. I don't think this project will ever be finished. I think it'll be halfway done forever because there'll be something else I want to tweak on it. But that seems to be the case with many great costume pieces, is they're never quite done. You're always adding something to them, or you're thinking you can improve this one section and replacing this one section, or yeah, it's just don't expect to have it ever be finished done. Don't expect to not learn 110 things on the way. When attaching the sleeves, you can see how as I'm ironing them, you can see how all the gatherings in the top of the sleeves kind of, and that poof I was talking about earlier, and that was really interesting and challenging to figure out how to iron. And I have to be very careful when I iron this tailcoat, because if I don't, I'll reinforce creases where I don't want them in the shoulders. So yeah, that takes quite a bit of time. I was really lucky, like I was with the thread with the shoulder pads for this garment. I actually found some that had been taken out of something else in the same drawer next to the threads, so I got permission to use them. So I didn't have to go out and buy new shoulder pads. I got to use some shoulder pads from something else that was no longer owned, that was altered in the past. They actually work really well. So the shoulder pads don't help where you think they would really with the shoulder. They tend to help more with the collarbone area and the transitioning to the shoulder with this jacket, and just help that line look a little crisper at the edge of the collarbone where it transitions into the shoulder when I move my arm around. And yeah, I ended up attaching them. I would fold them in half, and then the middle part I kind of whip stitched into the seam hem, and at the last minute I decided to narrow my sleeves a little bit. So that's what you see me doing, is actually making a last minute change to have my sleeves look a little more gathered at the wrist. And then I decided to be brave and do another thing I have never done before. So a lot of people won't even try buttonholes without a machine attachment that's meant for specifically buttonholes. But I decided that I was going to go ahead and try to do buttonholes for the buttons at the end of my sleeves, proper buttonholes, and have the buttons actually go through holes. And I had to measure out where they were going to go, and I had to do the buttonhole stitching by hand. So that was another thing that was an interesting challenge, and I was actually surprised how long it took to figure out where I should affix the buttons to this jacket. It took a lot longer than I thought it was going to. I think I detached the top two buttons like 3 or 4 times and then resewed them into another spot, despite trying to use chalk to figure out where the best place to attach them was. I do not think I could have gotten the buttons as even as I did on both sides without the dress dummy. That dress dummy was really, really crucial in making sure that the fine details and all the way through like every step of the way was just made immensely better with the dress dummy. There to help with each little bit. So I'm really glad I invested in that dress dummy, because it just made a lot of the detail work immensely easier. Especially since I was making the item for myself versus somebody else. If it was somebody else, I would be like, I need you to come over here and tolerate me for several hours while I fit you to certain parts of it, fiddle with it, discover it doesn't work, refit you, refix the things that didn't work, blah, 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 blah. So I just think the quality overall went up like a lot because I used the dress dummy. At the beginning of the video, you see the dress dummy with ribbons going through all the gaps because this is a really fancy adjustable one. And you're supposed to use padding and ribbon to fill in all those things. And to be honest, it didn't work very well. And I actually found that it got in the way of the dress dummy doing its job. So one by one, the little pieces came off, except for a couple spots where it was stubborn. But yeah, it's at the point now where there's nothing stuck to it, and I just accept that there's going to be gaps. It really doesn't affect it too much, despite what one might think it would do. So, yeah, you can see me taking it off and just kind of adjusting where the last little bit of the buttons go. And I really had to make sure that the jacket was on the dress dummy, even with the shoulder seams in the right spot. And I spent a lot of time. Despite having proper buttonholes for the end of the sleeves, I decided that the middle back decoration part, which is meant to, in suits, adjust the waist a little bit. Say somebody's more of a V-shaped body versus a up and down rectangle slim body. Or maybe they're a little rounder on the bottom because they have like a beer belly. That little piece I just decided to make faux and fixable, considering how high up I made the tail slit go. Because I was worried that I would just continuously lose the piece if I actually added proper buttonholes for it. But I thought that the proper buttonholes were worth it at the end of the cuff and actually helped keep the sleeve where it needed to be when I was wearing it. So that's something to consider is, do you want to add the buttons just as decoration? Will they look okay just as decoration? If you want buttonholes, is it really worth the extra effort to make sure the buttonholes are the right size and everything? So, yeah, that was interesting. Another thing I had with my sleeves is, how did I position the buttonholes so it looked like that they were actually serving a substantial function and they didn't look too funny, but they didn't result in too much of a crease in my sleeve with the taper. So that was fun to figure out. I ended up using, you can use buttons with holes for them, but for this particular project, I ended up using buttons that had like one hole in the back and then the front was like a solid. Back in the old days, they were made of metal. These are made of plastic with just like a shiny metallic surface paint on them, or they were plasti dipped or something to make them shiny. Or gilded, and I went ahead and chose the ones I chose, and I was really fortunate to find enough buttons for the front, the back, and the sleeves. And what's interesting is I think they're 3 separate sizes all with the same design, and I was just really, really happy to find them all with the same design because I had gone out of my way just making sure every little bit was just perfect. So I used my hem gauge to figure out what size the buttonholes actually needed to be, because if you make the buttonholes too big, the buttons will just fall out of them all the time. But if you make it too narrow, you'll never get the buttons through the holes. And what's the point of having a buttonhole if you can't button and unbutton it? So that was a lot of time that you can't really see on camera of me just researching exactly how much bigger the buttonhole needed to be compared to the button for the style of button, and then the best way to secure the button and make sure it was in the proper place for the buttonhole, etc., etc. So that was an adventure all on its own. The sleeves were an adventure. The buttonholes were an adventure. The collar and lapels were an adventure. My recommendation is either learn how to pattern, or do collars, or do sleeves, or do buttonholes. Don't do that to yourself all at once. Add one thing a project. Don't do what I do. I really, honestly, almost didn't finish the project. So, yeah, here I am with the last little fine-tuned details in. I'm really glad. I'm so impressed with myself. I still kind of look at it when I get it out, and I'm like, how the heck did I get flat fabric and turn it into a tailcoat? Wow, I did that. Wow. If you have to, stop and cry and be overwhelmed. Don't be afraid to ask for help when you're making something that's this big. And push yourself to your limits. Even if you've never done something before or never done several steps before, if you really, really want something, that's not necessarily a reason to not try to do it anyways. Might be worth the risk. You might end up with a tailcoat. Hope you guys have a great day. Bye. Thanks for watching.